You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
And I'm Martin Robbins.
This week, why the government launching a consultation about consultations. But first, why are the public falling out of love with science?
So, James, we've both talked about our radicalization journeys on this podcast, and I think a key point of that is that we both grew up more or less in an age where it felt like progress was just inevitable, right? So when I was a child, I could look up into the night sky from my bed at my grandparents' house in Sutton, through the window, obviously, like they did have a roof and everything, and I could see Concorde, a supersonic jet, flying overhead, streaking across the sky, and then they were building like a tunnel under the English Channel, or the French Channel if you're French, to like connect us to the continent and have high-speed trains running through it for the first time. And we weren't even worried about Napoleon invading. And then, we had Tim Berners-Lee invent the internet, which in hindsight feels like a bit of a mistake, but it was an incredible age, James.
Martin, I didn't realise we were doing like nostalgia content for millennials. I feel like I should be looking at a Facebook meme. Oh yeah, we used to go out on our bikes and we used to text each other on our Nokia 3310s and then buy some top-up credit from a shop and have to type it in to a text message or whatever, how else you did it. Yeah, but no, I agree. It was a slightly different time. The progress was visible. I think the most visible sign of progress back then was video games. At the start of the 90s, you had your 16-bit era where games looked like shit. And then by the end of the 2000s, you had the PS2, I think, by that point, or we were on the cusp of the PS2. And I remember seeing screenshots from Tekken Tag Tournament, one of the launch games, thinking, my God, this is photorealistic. There is no way graphics can get better than this. But since then, 3D graphics have just got slightly better. Compare a PS5 to a PS4, basically indistinguishable. So yeah, the sense of progress does not feel as palpable.
Yeah, and inevitably, James has brought it back to computer games. But, back in the real world, I mean, it's not like there weren't serious problems in the 80s and 90s. There was the whole, Cold War thing and miners going on strike and all that kind of stuff. Britain fell out of the exchange rate mechanism, whatever that was, in 1992. But it still generally felt like science and technology and engineering were all moving relentlessly forwards and making people richer, wealthier, generally making the world a more better and exciting place. And I think it's fair to say that there has been just a tiny bit of a vibe shift in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I'd even say a bit more recent than just our entire lifetimes, because I'm a technology journalist, or I have been over my career. And when I first started, it was that sort of just immediate sort of post-iPhone years when new things were exciting. We had these amazing new gadgets in our pockets. We had things like Facebook and YouTube and all these new platforms which were very exciting and allowing us to do new things. And then, Brexit, Trump, Elon Musk, and suddenly there was that vibe shift. The high status opinion became to be sort of, you've got to be cynical and disgusted with technology and big tech and the tech bros. We had to think AI is either going to be just a big nothing burger or it was going to destroy the world. It had to be one or the other. And, people would go, self-driving cars, it'll never work. Or look at all these big promises. And we're just seeing nothing happen. It's just all hype and nonsense.
Yeah, and I mean, in fairness, they've got a point. I think a lot of technology in the last 10 years or so isn't really as good as it used to be, like whether it's cars or, the internet in general, the fact that everything's plastered in cookie warnings. Cookies used to be something we loved when we were children, and now they're just a plague on the internet. But so anyway, while you were sunning yourself on your recent holiday, James, the Campaign for Science and Engineering, friends of the pod, I think we can say, have released a major new study on public attitudes to R&D, research and development. And I'm just going to go straight in here and start with the statistic that 40% of the public, James, have never heard of R&D and have basically no idea what it is.
I mean, that's sort of shocking, but I'm not going to shame the general public here, Martin, because I know that in their hearts, the general public are kind, decent people, and they basically know fuck all about all sorts of things, not just science and engineering.
Yeah, I mean, and in fairness, I'm being a little bit cheeky here. So once the survey explains that R&D stands for research and development, that actually rose quite significantly to sort of 80% or so. But I love that as just a great lesson in the fact that even if you're using familiar jargon, it's still quite jargony and it still loses a surprisingly large percentage of people when you're talking about a topic. But yeah, amazingly, for people with a university degree, still a third of those didn't actually know what R&D stood for, which is a little bit like if you worked in a container port and you didn't know what a TEU is. But anyway, moving on from niche content for our nerdier viewers.
One day, Martin, we're going to do a special on containers because I think we both love container ports. But I am going to defend the humanities graduates here, Martin, because, we may not be contributing anything of value to society. But if you need to know what the dagger in Macbeth is a big metaphor for, then you're going to come crawling back to us and wishing you'd not treated us with this sort of disrespect.
I mean, aren't all swords in historical fiction something to do with the penis, James? But I mean, whatever. That's for the literature people to try and figure out. But moving back to the comfortable world of science and engineering. So Case are developing, in my opinion, a bit of a reputation for publishing somewhat surprising research on public attitudes that, in my opinion, don't get quite as much media attention as they deserve, particularly when it comes to the rise of the populist right, reform, and kind of what's going on that end of the political spectrum. They did some really interesting work earlier this year, which Alicia Grated came on the show and talked about several weeks ago, which found, for example, that reform voters are much more positive about skilled immigration than a lot of people would assume. There's obviously that kind of caricature that basically it's all kind of send them back and kick them over the channel. And actually, a lot of reform voters are quite welcoming to the idea of people coming in from other countries and contributing to R&D and science and technology in the UK, which kind of makes sense. And basically, the more that you look at this stuff, the more you kind of realize that the way these topics are talked about in Westminster and in the media extension of Westminster is incredibly two-dimensional, and it relies on an almost cartoonishly simple image of what the public actually think and feel about any given topic.
Yeah, I agree with you. It drives me a bit crazy, the sort of immigration debate. Obviously, I'm not a massive fan of all of the being horrible to migrant stuff the government are doing at the moment, but it just seems so strange because you get there's obviously a political reason why the government want, for example, the net migration figures to be going down so they can point at a number and say, look at this number, it's falling, but it's so self-defeating. And I think people can obviously see that when you're saying to high-skilled postgraduates who have come here, trained here at our universities, and then saying, now get back to your own country and go and earn loads of money and use all your skills there. We should be trying to keep people like that here, but that requires a sort of more nuanced view of immigration and and the rules around it.
Yeah, and I mean, even at the macro level, the big numbers have gone down massively since Labour have been in power. And, I remember talking to a reform-curious friend of a friend who basically just didn't accept that number was true. And so at some point it's like, great, you're working really hard to make this number go down. Nobody actually cares. And the stuff that people do care about, you're sabotaging as well. So, bravo, keep up the good work. But coming back to the latest study, so Case have surveyed 8,000 adults across Britain. And the kind of headline picture of this is that we're basically becoming a nation of withdrawn pessimists, hiding behind our curtains in darkened rooms, a bit like me now trying to make this podcast at 3:00 on a Saturday afternoon. So the public think that Britain is in decline. They actually say that we need to protect our minorities, but they think we have too many of our own problems to be wasting effort helping other countries and populations around the world or dealing with global issues. Only about 38% of people who are the sort of hardcore optimists think that things can get better in the UK. It's fair to say I think we've moved on from the halcyon days of 1997, James, and over half of people feel that technology is moving too fast, that actually it's causing more problems than it's solving.
That's so depressing, Martin. I mean, people say they like our podcast because we're a bit optimistic, so I worry now that we're going to just make everyone miserable. But does this mean that people are sort of skeptical about research and development as well? Because surely they still think that's a good thing.
So not yet, but I think what's interesting is that all these other sort of numbers that Case are coming up with are kind of like the canary in the coal mine. Because while the public haven't fallen out of love with research yet, the results paint a picture of a public that increasingly doesn't really know what research is happening in the UK. They're very out of touch with who actually does research, like what is a researcher, where is research taking place, and they feel very disconnected from the results of it. So they understand in an abstract sense that doing research can be a good thing and it can provide benefits and improve people's lives. But if they look around them at the places where they live and their own lives, they actually struggle to identify any way that this kind of progress or research is making their lives any better. And that's something that's really, really important if you care about Britain remaining a world leader in R&D and being a prosperous high-tech nature in the future, because if the public doesn't believe in science and research, then the political support for spending money on those things starts to dissipate, and even the kind of belief in the results that they're producing, as we've seen in America, for example, with vaccine science.
So, Martin, break it down for me. So, what do the public actually think a researcher is? Should we see more lab coats on our high streets? Would that change people's minds?
Yeah, so maybe let's step back a bit. So are you familiar with the Robin Williams sitcom Mork and Mindy, James?
Amazingly, I am. I've never actually seen it, but I do remember there used to be trailers for it on the Paramount Comedy channel, because after Nickelodeon closed down at 7 p.m, they'd switch over to Paramount. My parents didn't have Paramount. It just switched off, but they always got the first 2 minutes with trailers, and Mork and Mindy was on there. So the one thing I know is Robin Williams is an alien in the show, and also that weirdly it's a spin-off of Happy Days.
Yeah, apparently they could either go with the alien or the shark, and they chose the alien. It was just easier to put on TV screens. Very niche TV tropes joke for the keen listener there.
Actually, one other thing about Mork and Mindy, and I do want to throw this in just because I find this absolutely maddening, and I feel it's the sort of thing that our audience are going to be driven insane by once you realise it as well. So Mork and Mindy, they first appeared in Happy Days, which was made in the 70s but set in the 1950s. When they made the Mork and Mindy TV show, it was set in the contemporary 70s. So how does that work from a continuity perspective with Happy Days? I don't know.
It's just one of many problems with Happy Days that we'll almost certainly come back and attempt to address in a future episode. But essentially, and this is my own language. It's not something Case said in their report. But basically,
there wasn't a long section on Mork and Mindy in the report.
No, surprisingly little about that topic. But essentially, the public view researchers a lot like Mork, as in kind of a benevolent alien creature, someone who's good at maths and knows their way around a test tube. Probably very much at home in a lab, maybe even born in a test tube, like Mork famously was. They didn't survey the test tube part, but essentially someone who's very different, very kind of remote. They don't really know what researchers do or where they do it, but they assume it involves labs and test tubes and computers and a lot of statistics, weirdly enough.
I mean, that's basically my sort of clip art picture of what a science lab looks like. So I don't know, I guess like Mr. Spock would be another example of this sort of thing.
Yeah, and who knows where Spock does his science? Like, we never see it on Star Trek. I refuse to believe it happens on the bridge, because nobody is getting work done on the bridge of a starship. Like, you've got a captain there constantly doing Zoom calls on the big screen, like with audio. Like, he's not even wearing headphones when he's having his like diplomatic calls and shit. Absolute nightmare. So, like, sure, maybe you could do some science if he went off somewhere. Occasionally it's in like the med bay, because apparently science and medicine are the same thing. Most of the time it just seems to be a weird pair of binoculars stuck into a desk that he peers into. But, who am I? I'm not an expert on 23rd century science, James. But what's even more disturbing is the
colour of the uniforms. Why are the medical people wearing the same colour as the science people and not the engineering people? Why do the engineering people, surely they're more similar to science than medicine? It doesn't make any sense.
Exactly, James. And once again, topics for a future podcast, no doubt. But what's kind of more disturbing is that only 29% of people could think of ways that R&D benefits the UK. And if they talked about their own region, that fell to 22%. And for their local area, like 18%. And as you would expect, right, those numbers are lower the more deprived the area is that you're in. So if you're in London, yeah, sure, you can see R&D happening around you, and you can maybe see some of the benefits of that a bit more visibly. If you're in, the back end of the north of England in a struggling post-industrial town, it's pretty hard to understand in practical terms, like, what is all this science stuff actually doing to improve my life, which is generally getting worse.
What's sort of astonishing about this, Martin, is that this survey, and we're talking about this now, not so long ago after the vaccine rollout, which I think was, all things considered, a pretty good example of R&D making a pretty big impact on our lives.
Yeah, it is sort of fascinating, because obviously, like, the pandemic was an incredible science event in a sense. Like, the vaccine rollout is one of the most successful R&D exercises in recent times, and yet the speed of it actually, in some respects, made people quite nervous. It almost frightened people that you could produce a vaccine in a couple of months instead of years as they were used to. And I think for all of the modern technology we have, when you actually look at the impacts on your lives, like I would argue computers not really any better now than they were 10 years ago. I think once we got to like an iPhone, an iPad, and a MacBook Pro, like there's not really been much improvement since then, unless you're doing really kind of high-end stuff. Browsing the internet, worse than it was 10 years ago. Social media, basically a bonfire now. Used to be like a happy place. You'd go and make up hashtags, and now it's full of Nazis. And, we've talked about car parking or like using public services where in theory technology can make it a lot better. In practice, it just means you've got 17 different apps on your phone and none of them work and your car gets flooded, which isn't really about the technology, but just a personal grievance of mine. So it's kind of not surprising. And this comes up in some of the deep dive interviews that Case did. So once they got into a discussion with people and they started prompting them a bit more, it was easier for people to start picking out things like air fryers, for example, which are miraculous. ChatGPT, which is less miraculous, but fun, let's say. WhatsApp, which even your nan is using now, or your parents or whatever. Streaming on TV, like these are all things people, when they're prompted, they'll say, that's quite good. I like the fact that I've got Netflix, even though it costs 18 quid a month or whatever. I like the fact that I can cook chicken in a bucket in 15 minutes or whatever. Please don't follow any recipes we give out. But crucially, they didn't actually think those things made their lives much better in terms of happiness or well-being. And there's a suggestion in there that apps are a major part of that disconnect.
So people are happy they can get, their Deliveroo or use WhatsApp, but I guess they're worried about getting too fat or that their uncle's becoming some mad conspiracy theorist because of social media or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of a sense that, okay, these technologies are convenient, but they don't make us feel good or feel better in a way. And we could do a whole other episode on this, and I'm sure we will at some point. But I think a major root cause of this is that the tech industry in the 2010s really obsessively focused and drilled down into this kind of narrow metric-driven development. So they're fixating on, how engaged are people in the products? How much time are they spending on Facebook? Like, how convenient is it? How many of their photos are they sharing? How many posts do they like? How quickly can they complete a task? Because those are easy things to measure and optimize and to some extent improve and juice the statistics for most of your users. But it's much harder to measure well-being or mood. Like, how do I feel when I use Facebook? Like, if I've been scrolling on my phone, but angry for the most part.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Incredibly angry. But if you're scrolling your phone, like it's easy to measure like how many reels do people scroll through. But how do they feel when they wake up and they've spent half an hour going through random clips of influencers and God knows what? It doesn't necessarily make them feel better or that they've achieved anything with their day. And in a weird way, it's like the tech industry is a bit like other industries were in the 1950s, where it would just be like, you'd see an advert on TV that would like, hey, try new fruit haze. It's 97% sugar and full of lithium. You'll be cheerful for days. And it's like, yeah, that's great. And everyone would have it and stuff their faces with it. And then 5 days later, they'd be falling dead in the street of heart attacks. I'm not sure that's literally what happened, but metaphorically, that's what the 50s was like. People were sold stuff by unscrupulous advertisers. They ate it until they passed out in the street and died. And that's sort of where the tech industry is now. It's basically like junk food in the 60s. Like, it understands like that it can sell products, but it doesn't really have any concepts of the impact that it's having or the long-term harms that are created.
So do you think we'll look back like we do on the 50s now? You get these weird like 50s adverts and it's like, here's a fridge or something and it's full of asbestos and radium or something. In 50 years, are we going to look back on Facebook today and go, what were we all smoking?
I mean, yeah, almost literally. I wonder about like doctors that went on Twitter and like encouraged people to use Twitter. Doctors in like 2080 going to look back at that and say, man, this was like those ones in the 50s that said you should have a cigarette a day to keep the doctor away. Like, what were they doing? Bringing people onto social media? That's mad. Now we know that it rots your brain and takes 30 points off your IQ. But like, surely they must have realized at the time, Japes.
So Martin, I guess what you're saying is this all feeds into people thinking that technology is moving too fast and that's what's driving that sort of fear.
Well, you'd think so, but it turns out that people are basically impossible. And so people simultaneously think that technology is moving too fast, but also that it's moving too slow. So hydrogen boilers, for example, or they didn't mention it specifically, but I would imagine things like electric car infrastructure. There's a perception that, oh, we've been promised these things for years now. Where are they? Why aren't a lot of these things getting any better? And I think a lot of this comes back to a complaint that I've often had about human beings, which is that we're really, really bad at understanding the difference between big numbers and small numbers, and like what is big or expensive, what is small or cheap. We've talked before about £1 billion, for example. £1 billion is a rounding error for the NHS budget. When Captain Tom was doing his lengths up and down the garden in support of supposedly the NHS, in reality a charity adjacent to the NHS, and then ultimately a whole other charity that we're not going to go into on this podcast for legal reasons, but involved a very nice spa that got demolished. This kind of stuff, the money raised is absolutely negligible. It is nothing in the context of the NHS. And I think there's something similar with some of these technologies. Like, it's almost like people have their own perception of how hard are different things, but actually they don't really match up with reality that well. So people, as I mentioned, were very nervous about the speed of the vaccine rollout, because in people's minds, medical research takes like 10 years or 5 years. Like, the idea you could just wake up tomorrow and be like, on Star Trek, hey, you've done some numbers on Mr. Spock's little binocular machine, and suddenly we've got a vaccine in the space of one episode. Like, if that happened in real life, the Enterprise crew would not be lining up to take the vaccine. They'd be sitting there going, what the fuck, Spock? This doesn't seem legitimate. Have you even done a peer-reviewed, like, Cochrane gold standard clinical trial? Like, what do you know? You think I'm going to jab that thing in my arm? You're not even human. There'd be just fear and mistrust and loathing, and the whole crew would fall apart. So you're battling against people's existing conceptions. But then on the other hand, if they look at something like hydrogen boilers, why is that going to take so long? It's just a boiler. Like, you sell boilers every day. Like, what's the issue? So there's sort of an underestimation of the complexity of other things. Like, why can't I just deploy a massive wind farm in the North Sea? Like, why is it so difficult? And I think that's the thing. Like, people's perceptions are just somewhat out of whack with these abstract things that are happening.
I'm going to derail slightly, Martin. What is a hydrogen boiler? I'd never heard of a hydrogen boiler until you started using the word hydrogen boiler. I'm familiar with a heat pump and like a normal boiler, whatever that would be called.
It's sort of a computer. We're going to get calls in if I try and explain it now off the cuff. But essentially, it's an alternative to heat pumps. Basically, the idea is, instead of using gas boilers, why don't we just use ones where hydrogen is the gas? Apparently, it's all very safe now. It sounds a tiny bit explosive, but I'm really only saying that to goad people who know more than me into rising into the podcast and explaining them better. And actually, it's kind of surprising that it came up in the report, because I'm not sure how many members of the public unprompted would have randomly talked about hydrogen boilers, but stranger things have happened.
So I'm going to go down a Wikipedia rabbit hole in a bit, looking at hydrogen boilers, I think. Anyway, Martin, so this all sounds very negative from what you're saying. The public, they sound sort of cynical and miserable. Are there any positives to this research? Do people still like research? Surely people still see, in principle, it being quite a good thing.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the most interesting findings was about failure. And again, this is one of those times when I think, as much as we joke about it, I generally believe in public opinion. I think the public, even if they don't know exactly what they want, generally they're vibing in the right kind of direction. And the public...
We might disagree here, Martin.
Well, I think, you can look at, like, let's say, obviously you and I were on the Remain side of the Brexit vote, but I can also understand from a public perception that, like, things are going in the wrong direction. We've been given an opportunity to roll the dice and do a course correction, and I kind of get that. In the same sense, I get them not voting for Jeremy Corbyn and then also wanting to chuck out Rishi Sunak kind of later. Like, the public, generally speaking, they're not always correct. But like I said, and this is a phrase I'm going to stick to, they're vibing in the right direction. Don't try and interrogate it. None of us know what that means. So I think an example of this is, like, the public are often much more sophisticated about topics than politicians in the media give them credit for. So we talked about immigration at the start of this episode. Another area I think that comes up is the concept and the importance of failure in doing things like research. So over half of the public accepts that failure is a vital part of R&D. So they think we should invest in R&D, and they also understand that some of those investments won't work. And I think that's fascinating in the context of a media environment where if any government agency does anything and it costs like, I don't know, £2 million or something, the papers will be charging in going, oh, but you've wasted money. You did this thing and it didn't work the way you wanted it to. What a waste. Oh. And actually, the public are much more sophisticated than that. They understand that if you try things, some of them are going to not work. And they're totally chill about that, which is fantastic. They're also skeptical, like they understand that the private sector is a bit more agile and this moves in, tends to own a lot more R&D. They seem to almost overestimate the amount of R&D that the private sector does, but they're keen for the government to focus on it. Like they do see it as a public good and they see it as a risk that is worth taking, which I think is a really healthy attitude.
God, maybe you are persuading me they are vibing in the right direction because, yeah, I agree with you entirely on the risk thing. It does infuriate me how the entire lobby correspondent mindset is to try and sort of poke holes. It would be a lot better if we could have a culture, certainly in politics and in Westminster, where failure was understood in context. As we tried this thing, it didn't work. The DWP, they tried a bunch of AI stuff not so long ago, and it didn't work. And it was a good test. It was a good trial to see what could happen. But then obviously a lot of the sort of the reporting on it was, well, they tried this thing and it failed and therefore it's bad, rather than they tried this thing, it didn't work, we'll try something else.
Yeah, it's this constant like gotcha culture. It's not big, it's not clever, it's profoundly stupid in fact, and it doesn't really educate anyone about what's going on. And so I think it's really heartening to see that the public don't really fall into that trap. And actually there's some real ambition there, right? So half of people want Britain to be a world leader in R&D, which again, I think just shows how disastrous a lot of recent decisions have been. So whether it's the crackdown on visas for research, which again have broad support across the population, even among reform voters, for example, the recent handling of life sciences in the UK, where we are a world leading power in life science, but we have companies like AstraZeneca that are struggling to make much progress in the UK because of the various differences and frankly slowness of the government in working with them. And people want to see R&D facilities built in their local area. They recognize it's going to boost the local economy. Above all, though, they want to hear more about what's happening. And I think that's maybe where some of the disconnect is as well. And I think people's perceptions of R&D are still very narrow. They still associate it with scientists, labs, test tubes. They don't tend to think as much about R&D in the context of computer games, for example, or culture or cinema. Like huge amounts of R&D happens in filmmaking or television. The legal system, law, anywhere where you're researching new ways to do something is R&D. But we're not very good at explaining that to the public across society. And so the more that we can do that, and the more that we can show them that interesting things are happening and they're happening in their area and they're making things better, the better it's going to be and the more abundance we're going to have in the future. They just really want to hear more from people, even businesses.
And presumably as well from podcasters, Martin. I hope so.
Well, this is slightly awkward, James, because apparently there are two groups of people that the public does not want to hear about R&D from. One of them, I think you could probably guess, James, is...
Surely politicians or something, or estate agents.
Yeah, politicians. I mean, politicians are right at the top of the list of people who should probably just stay quiet, other than here's some money. And then social media influencers and specifically podcasters. Apparently, 62% of the public think, James, that we personally are untrustworthy.
This is devastating. My entire self-worth is being denigrated. So I guess if you want to try and keep that up, to keep me doing this podcast, please like and subscribe to this show, or make sure you're subscribed to your podcast app. Tell your friends about the show, because apparently we need your help because nobody trusts us.
Yeah, and we'll try not to lie too blatantly. In fact, for every new subscriber, we promise to correct one falsehood that we propagated in a previous episode. How about that?
Yeah, we'll try and cut down on the false information. So yeah, now let's move on to something else. Next up, we've got an interview with the Pope. So, Martin, have you been following any of this Labour leadership drama that seems to have kicked off while I was on holiday? The whole thing about briefing against Wes Streeting and all of that?
Okay, so I'll bite, James. Who's Wes Streeting?
It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this. It just, for some reason, and I can't quite work this out, because I was on holiday, I was there, I was in Mexico, I was sat on the beach in my partner's brother's beach house. It was idyllic. The sunshine was going, there was a gentle breeze, I was looking out over the Gulf of America, I was relaxed as hell, and then I just got a notification on my phone that was like, the whole British government's gone completely mental. And I don't know what happened. There was a big briefing war against Wes Streeting because apparently Keir Starmer's leadership is now like an open question in Westminster.
Yeah, and it clearly went well, so that's all been resolved. So fantastic. Another good example, by the way, James, of social media apps doing very, very well on engagement, possibly not quite so well on the mental health aspects, I think. Did you feel better after you saw that notification or before?
Yeah, I was pretty scared by it, Martin, because, I've written the whole thing on my Substack about the leadership battle more generally, but I think that for all the current government's faults, they're actually quite good in terms of sort of abundance-coded ideas. There's a lot of good things happening, particularly around sort of housing and so on, and we've got it pretty good at the moment. So now the idea of changing it, the idea of shaking up the apple cart or whatever the expression is, and having someone new potentially come in, that seems a bit scary. And a really good example why is because of an announcement just the other day from Steve Reed, the current Secretary of State for, MHCLG, the Ministry of Housing, the Housing Secretary. That's who he is. He came out with a whole bunch of, I think, really quite good announcements.
So Steve Reed, of course, famous for what we're going to euphemistically call the brownfield situation in Cambridge. Has he changed his mind on Cambridge sewage works? Is that one of them?
Sadly, not as far as I'm aware. So you can go back a few weeks on the show to listen to our episode about the Cambridge sewage works. That was a whole, almost literal shit show where they weren't going to move a sewage works to unlock a whole load of new housing in Cambridge. But what is good is there's been a whole few more nudges in the right direction. It sort of shows that how if you've actually got someone in office whose mantra is, as he's said many times, build, baby, build, then theoretically he can keep pushing all the rules and regulations, all these little technocratic changes in the right direction, which I think can make quite a big difference.
Okay, so what's he done, James?
So the big news is, this is what the government have been keen to shout about, is that the rules are being changed so that if housing is proposed near train stations in the future, there'll essentially be an attitude of having a default yes in response. So basically the burden of opposing new housing near a train station, that will be on the opponents. They'll have to prove why it's a bad idea, which is a whole sort of change in attitude as to how a lot of planning is approached. So yeah, theoretically, a developer will be able to come along and say, we want to build this enormous block of flats next to this train station, and it will be just slightly easier to get it built. And this is a really good thing. We've talked on the show a number of times about how transit-oriented development is such a really good idea because, you can have walkable communities, people can live somewhere where they don't need to own a car. And crucially, to make this possible, the train station that you generally need to make it happen, it already exists. You don't need to spend billions on new railway connections. So this is like the best possible places to build housing. And this is going to make it slightly easier.
And so there's no catch here. It's not going to need a new law. There's not going to be a big fight in Parliament about it.
No, this is the best part, and this shows why the people in power does actually matter. So this is a big change that's going to come to the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, which is basically a set of national planning guidelines that the Secretary of State can pretty much change how he likes. I'm sure it's slightly more complicated than that, and there's a sort of consultation layer to it. But basically, it's this document, and he says, this is how we could think about planning, and this is how it's done. And they're going to update it. And apparently later this year, it's going to be all changed to be sort of more, quote, pro-growth and rules-based, which is nice. So there's no super duper details on this yet. We don't know exactly how close you'll have to be, but they do say it will be within, reasonable walking distance of a well-connected stations. So again, it's just nudging things in the right direction.
Awesome. And so there's a bunch of things here, James. So other stuff as well?
Yeah, so as press releases go, it was sort of quite packed and you had to pass through quite carefully to work out all of the big things in there. So the other thing that I think is quite impactful is they're changing the call-in powers. So at the moment, you have a planning application, and when it's considered sufficiently important, the government in Westminster can, quote, call it in and basically take over the planning application from whichever local council is making the decision. So, like the Universal Theme Park near you, Martin, that we've talked about on the show, that's not going to be Bedfordshire County Council deciding whether there's a Harry Potter roller coaster or whatever, but the Housing Secretary will be doing that instead.
And that's terrible news for the parishioners of Amtil, for example, who are going to be gravely impacted by light pollution from fireworks happening several miles away on the other side of a row of hills. And they won't be able to complain about that and rinse Universal theme parks for a load of money for local projects.
I love the fact we've been doing this pod for so long, Martin, now that we've got law attached to everything we talk about. We can go, there's a previous show with a whole other absolutely mad story that people can go back and enjoy. We'll put a link to that in the podcast description. So basically, this whole regime is being changed for housing as well. So now Steve Reed has said that when there's a application for a development of more than 150 homes, the local council will have to basically tell central government, will have to tell MHCLG about it. So Steve Reed, or the housing secretary, can basically make a decision on whether to call it or not there and then, rather than wait for the whole process to play out and for there to be controversy. If Steve Reed sees a development that's been proposed and he just wants to take control of it, he'll know about it, so he'll be able to take it and speed things up straight away.
Yeah, and that's a nice one for larger developments, I guess, as well. I imagine we'll see a lot of developments with 151 houses being built on them, because effectively it's pushing the bias towards getting smaller numbers of larger developments built rather than having lots of tiny piecemeal ones, which is good if you want to build 1.5 million houses in 4 years.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a huge deal, especially because, like you say, building at that volume is what we're going to need to fix the housing crisis. And, I think I found some data from Litchfields. This was just me Googling around on my own, so please don't take this as gospel, but I found a fascinating PDF from Litchfields, who are like a planning consultancy of some sort. And they basically listed hundreds and hundreds of developments around the country, which were all had the number of homes in the hundreds, or 150 plus and stuff like that. So, yeah, it sounds like this could really move the needle on that sort of thing if we've got a sufficiently motivated Secretary of State, and fingers crossed Steve Reed will continue to be motivated. Hopefully he's got a big approve stamp and he's just going stamp, 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 stamp.
I mean, that's the job that we would all love to have, isn't it, really? I could, oh man, give me that job. Just give me a fancy mahogany desk, some, those green lamps that you get in like films about law firms, and just a big pile of paper in like an in tray, a big massive stamp and an inkwell, and I'll just be like, stamp all day long. My God, that would be therapeutic.
Well, this is completely tangential, but apparently in Japan, a lot of the government still does literally rely on the actual physical stamp to make stuff legally, actually happen. So a lot of Japanese government bureaucracy does require someone there with a physical stamp. So there's still a lot of stamping going on over there. But anyway, Martin, I've got one final thing for you that was announced this week. And this is another little planning nudge. And this was about statutory consultees. So again, this is something we've talked about on the show ad nauseum, because this is bodies like Natural England, the sort of organisations who have to be consulted when there's a big development proposed.
Yes, friends of the pod, Natural England. Are they going to be out of the loop?
Sadly not. They are still going to be consulted, though. I think the government are planning to try and sort of reform what they do. But they are, interestingly, proposing removing a bunch of statutory consultees from the planning process. So again, not Natural England, but 3 lesser-known bodies. So we've got Sport England, who tend to be the consultee on things like playing fields and things like that. There's the Gardens Trust, and then the Theatres Trust, which I hadn't heard of until I read about this.
No, I'll be honest, I had no idea that actors were involved in the planning process. It explains a lot, but it's not something I was very familiar with.
Yeah, apparently this is a real thing. So in the 1970s, the government were worried about the loss of all the theatres that were shutting down because, TV was happening. We didn't need as many theatres, and there was seemed to be a loss of these cultural establishments. So they set up the Theatres Trust to keep an eye on this. In the intervening years, at some point, it became one of these statutory consultees. And today, it's just another one of those sort of billion tick boxes that people need to fill in and consult with when they want to build stuff.
But how does is Brian Blessed sitting in an office somewhere with a big pile of things and a pen, checking off planning applications? Does this actually stop developments?
So I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure how much of a big deal this is. I don't think this affects literally everything, but I imagine if you're sort of within the environs of a theatre, then it probably does have quite an impact, because one sort of mad example of this I found was from 2021. So in a town called Wallingford, which is in Oxfordshire, there's a historic theatre there called the Wallingford Corn Exchange, and someone proposed building 8 new flats. So not a very big number of flats, but 8 new flats near the Corn Exchange. And basically, at the time, the Theatres Trust intervened and stop this thing from being built because they persuaded the council to reject the application on the basis of, and this will sort of drive you mad in a sort of complicated way, because they worried that by building the flats, the new residents might object to the noise in the theatre and therefore cause the theatre to be shut down. And therefore they thought, well, let's just not build the flats.
I mean, I've just got visions of like Brian Cox walking around the street outside going, fuck off! Like, what the
I presume Brian Cox the actor, not Brian Cox the scientist.
Oh, both of them. They're both quite angry men, James.
It breaks my brain a bit, Martin, because it's just shitty rules interacting with other shitty rules. Because, like, you know, I get it. I don't think that local residents should have like a veto over a theatre making a bit of noise. If you buy a house near a theatre, you should probably expect it, you know, people to turn up and watch shows there. There was a whole thing in London a few months ago about a pub called the Seckford in Farringdon, a lovely old pub, and there was a whole thing about like people trying to get its license taken away because of noise. And I'm thinking, why would you buy a house near a 200-year-old pub if you didn't expect a little bit of noise? So I don't think that should happen. But at the same time, refusing planning permission just on this basis seems a bit bad. It seems like you could perhaps somehow write the rules so you could say you can build the houses there, but you can't kick off about the noise. That seems like a much more reasonable thing, so we can have the best of both worlds of having the housing and the theatre or the amenity or whatever.
So hopefully, and I agree, this is a ridiculous situation that basically rebel actors are stopping houses getting built. But we're going to stop this now, right? So this is actually going to be dealt with, and we're going to strike these off of the long list of objectives.
So I hope so, but to determine what to do, Martin, about too many consultations, the first thing the government needs to do is launch a consultation.
Oh, Christ almighty. Well, I can't wait to see the responses from BAFTA.
So, Martin, before we move on to this week's guest, let's do some quick bit of housekeeping. So if you're enjoying the Abundance Agenda this week, then do head over to Apple Podcasts, give us 5 stars and share the pod. Get a link to the podcast and, text it to your friends, post it on your social media. Feed our egos. We enjoy doing this show and we enjoy it more when we think people are listening. So just tell people about the show and encourage us to keep doing the show week in, week out.
So, James, we both have Substacks, I believe. I still have one. What have you been writing about this week, James?
Yeah, so even though I've been on holiday, Martin, I've actually had loads of stuff on my Substack. I've had a couple of fascinating guest posts. So I have one from Tim Sarichik, friend of the pod. We had him on our show a few weeks ago. Again, talking about autonomous cars, and he was basically writing about how Britain could win the autonomous car war with a company called Wave that could theoretically make a big impact, which is great news for growth as well as cool
let's
cars.
Hope it doesn't make a big impact. I think generally cars should try not to make impacts. I think that's the whole point with autonomous vehicles. I think if your autonomous car is making a big impact, something has gone terribly wrong and you probably need to rethink.
That's fair enough, Martin. And the other guest post was from Morgan Wild from Labour Together, the think tank. He wrote me a really, really interesting and nerdy piece on municipal bonds and how basically we could fund all of the infrastructure Britain needs by taking on slightly more risk and allowing local authorities to raise some cash. And it sounds counterintuitive because the government can borrow money more cheaply than a local authority can. But at the same time, a local authority would have a stake in actually delivering the goods and actually getting things built. So maybe we wouldn't get situations like HS2 going absolutely crazy out of control. Anyway, really fascinating thing. Oh, God, I've written something as well, Martin. I wrote about the Labour...
Christ, James.
I know.
Will the contents ever stop?
There is too much content in the world. I contributed to this. I wrote about the Labour leadership drama and basically a bit about why I'm a bit nervous about whoever comes next after Keir Starmer, despite his flaws. So you can go and read that and read me probably upsetting the vast majority of the Labour Party all on my Substack. Martin, have you been writing anything this week or has it all been on my end?
I mean, not as much as you, James, but then who has? No, I've been writing a load of old rubbish, and I'll leave it at that, but hopefully you'll see it on the stack sometime in the middle of next week. Hoping to get a bit of footage there as well after the success of my recent YouTube adventure. But the weather is not looking great this weekend, so we'll see how that goes.
I was going to say, if you haven't checked it out, go and look at Martin's video he did about the bridge to nowhere on HS2. We talked about it on the show a few weeks ago. You went down there with your drone and you produced a genuinely excellent YouTube video. Well worth your time. Like and subscribe to Martin over there. And we'll put links to our Substacks all on abundancepod.com. But now, let's get to our interview of the week, Martin. And this week is a cool one. We've got Fabian Chessell, who is one of the founders of the Data Alliance. He's a big government data guy. Basically, his argument is the government should be better at sharing sharing data with other bits of government. And so I talked to him to find out all about what the problem was and how he hopes to solve it. So we're delighted to be joined now by Fabian Chessell, the founder, or one of the founders of the Data Alliance. Fabian, this is a new alliance that you're putting together. You've got together a bunch of government digital people or data people from across various government departments, and you're saying the government needs to do data better. So could you start by just telling us what's the big problem here that you're trying to solve?
The big problem is right across government, you cannot share data. Well, you can, but it is so tough, so difficult that most efforts are long delayed, long grass, the team moves on and nothing really happens. And it's one of the sources of sludge within our public sector that just make everything from policing to healthcare to the benefits to your education systems work less good than it should.
And was there a particular moment or is there a particular example you think that really exemplifies this sort of problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's a funny one because it's something that if you are employed and you don't rely on government services, you're not going to encounter it that often. Like coming from Australia to the UK, I found suddenly my tax return didn't pre-populate in the way that it did in Australia. And certainly if you've been to the NHS, you'll have had the experience of having to repeat your allergies, your medications, your details again and again. And apart from that, how much do you really notice it? But the moment you start relying on government services, that's when it can really impact you. It's part of the reason it's super unfair because it'll impact the people who are worst off in our society. A fantastic example is one of my co-founders, Maura, has a son who is congenitally deaf with profound hearing loss. And every 2 years, she has to reapply to DWP for the support, even though, funnily enough, he's still congenitally deaf 2 years later. And even though the system knows that he's congenitally deaf because he's getting support from the NHS. But it can get worse than that. Like I found out the other day that the police are spending, I think, 770,000 hours a year redacting information from the CPS. And I sit there and I think, the CPS and the police aren't that different and shouldn't they be working as one team? And yet we're spending that amount of time, something like 500-600 police officers, half of Warwickshire Police Force is just spending their time redacting data from another bit of the criminal justice system. What a waste. What a waste.
So it's all about the frictions between all the different bits of government. I guess, like, if you've got a DWP who want to talk to another bit of DWP, they can probably reach into the database and get your stuff. But then if they need to pass the data to another government agency, that's where you hit all of these. Is it the bureaucratic or technical hurdles or legal hurdles? What are the sort of frictions there?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, on that, actually, I think there's a really, kind of data sharing laws, were invented in the world and sort of had a reasonable assumption that when you share data is when it moves across organizations' barriers. And it kind of sounds right. Like, you do probably want, if Facebook's going to talk to Google, you probably want some controls over that. What they didn't really factor in was in the public sector that we've actually split every single hospital hospital trust from every other hospital trust. We have, I think, 230 hospital trusts as separate organizations that therefore have to go for the full data sharing malarkey to share information between them. Same with the 43 police forces, same with the 330 odd councils. And if you then bear in mind that if you're trying to join the dots in York or London, you've got multiple GPs, multiple hospital practices, multiple councils, multiple police forces that you all have to agree. And that actually gets to your point about whether this is a technical issue or a bureaucratic issue. It is categorically a bureaucratic issue. It is about getting all of those different people to all agree to share data in this way, this much data in this way with these people in these circumstances. And it operates like a vetocracy. So if one of those organizations was to say no, or any one of them was to say no, or just two of them disagree on what is safe to share, you can't share that data. And that so it moves at the speed of the slowest another way to show that it's bureaucratic and not technical is if you look at what happened during COVID. Matt Hancock got some data for the NHS, and he said it took him 3 weeks to get data that he'd been asking for 3 years and the NHS couldn't provide. So the technical work couldn't have been more than 3 weeks in that 3-year cycle. And that's about right. It's sort of 2% technical, 98% bureaucratic.
So I guess a lot of these sort of data problems and all of the bureaucracy, the DPIA agreements, the data protection impact assessment, things like that, all this paperwork that needs to be done and slows things down. Is this like a lot of the things we talk about on our show, in that it was created for sort of a good reason? There's a lot of sensible rationale behind it, but you sort of add it all together and you just get this sort of snowballing effect and the gears start grinding and slowing things down.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is exactly that. It is exactly the same class of problem. It's like Old Bridge Way, right? Your favorite road. Is there anything that makes that illegal? No. That is a legal thing to do. We can build roads in this country. But what's happening in that situation is that regulation is interacting with another regulation, which is interacting with ownership, which is interacting with budgeting cycles, which is interacting with processes and procedures and statutory consultees and all that good stuff. And it just becomes impossible. It's one of the reasons why, as a topic, it confuses so many people. Because I've talked to directors in government about this and MPs, and they go, it's confusing. I'm hearing on one hand, this thing is impossible. And on the other hand, it is completely legal and we've got the laws that we need. And the answer is it's both. It is absolutely legal in a lot of the situations, and it's all but impossible with everything once it's all been piled up on top. As a country, I think we know how to deal with things that are illegal. We change the law. We know how to deal with things that are legal and we want to do more of, which is we fund them more. What we don't really have a good playbook for is how to deal with problems that are, on one hand, legal, but on the other hand, there's so much regulation sludge, whatever it is, that makes it impossible.
And this, I guess, brings me to the Data Alliance, the body that you created. And this is actually, was this an acronym or a backronym? Because what does Data Alliance stand for?
The Don't Ask Twice Action Alliance. And yes, I think it is a backronym. We started with... what we wanted to do. At first, we were the Don't Ask Twice Alliance, but then we kept calling ourselves the Don't Ask Twice Alliance, which just offended the sensibilities. So we added the word action in.
Fantastic. And what is Don't Ask Twice? Why is this one of sort of the big ideas behind what you're pushing for?
It's a really good question. And it's because one of the big successes in early days GDS was the tell us once idea that, when someone is deceased, we shouldn't have to go through and tell multiple government organizations that. It's successfully delivered. They'll tell you there's still gaps, but, as is the way with government. But at least it showed, the direction that we want to head. And so for us, that was the vision that we wanted to capture, that idea of government kind of just working. They have the information, and you've told them once, and they just use it. It's also quite interesting because there are countries and I fear that you're going to ask me which ones, because I'm going to guess that it's Belgium and Singapore, but I don't hold me to that have implemented tell us once laws that say the government must, in preference to asking the same question again, use the data it already holds to answer that question, which are collectively called tell us once laws.
So I guess a really good example of this would be if I move house and change my address, I currently need to, tell probably HMRC, I need to tell the driving license agency, the DVLA. If I was receiving benefits, I'd need to tell DWP and everything else like that. And there'd just be a whole load of paperwork and faffing around, and I'd probably forget one and wonder why something's been forgotten and there's envelopes piling up at my old house. And the idea is that the different governments should be able to share this data and talk to each other.
Yeah, absolutely right. That is the vision. And it's even worse than that. We've just moved house. I don't mind telling you, it's in Lambeth. We moved from Southwark Council to Lambeth Council. And I am having to get a parking permit. I'm having to upload onto Lambeth Council's parking website the council tax notification from our registration from Lambeth Council. These are trivial examples, and it kind of underplays the peril of this, which is, you and I kind of don't need to rely on that many government services. It doesn't impact us in the same way. Say that you were on benefits, or you had a child who had special educational needs, or heaven forfend that you've got intimate partner violence risks, or other elements of your safety are at risk. Ideally, the continuity of that would follow you along. The government has that record of interactions with you, knows your needs, knows your treatment or management plan or benefits entitlement or support, and that would follow you. And actually, most of the time it doesn't. It just kind of falls away until you remember that, oh God, I need to tell the council that I've got this disregard and I've got to re-enroll at my school for the free school meals, and I've got to make sure that the local police command is aware of some of the risks I'm under and some of the protection they need. And that shouldn't be the way. And that is where people fall into traps. It's where people fall between the cracks, or almost literally.
So that's the problem. So what's the solution to this? You've published a bunch of recommendations about how we can do things better. So tell me, how can we solve this problem and make the government, I don't know, talk to other bits of government better?
We started off the Data Alliance really with an observation that there were some people talking about how bad the problem was, but people hadn't put together a simple concrete plan. And I'd been delivery advisor for the Deputy Prime Minister, and one of the things that I realized is that when you're operating at that level, you need something that you can just go, tick, I want one of that, I like that plan, I want that. And that's what we've tried to create with the Data Alliance. And, we've got a 10-point plan, a manifesto, what have you. But like at a high level, there's sort of three things that we're trying to fix and three things we're trying to move away from. We're trying to move away from a situation where every new data share is treated like a snowflake, like cutting a new small path through the bush, and instead move to shared data infrastructures. So big highways that share your data. And I say infrastructures because the idea is not that we have one single big government database sat over the top of everybody, but that if you're in London, your healthcare organizations in London can work together to share your data. The second element is that, at the moment, the system's wildly conservative. It's far safer for people to say no than it is to do anything. There's no consideration, no balance of the costs of the risks of sharing with the costs of withholding. And what we want to do is move the presumption towards sharing. We've got an idea in this called duty to share, which says that if it is legal, you've got a duty to share. Because what happens is people think about a decision. What do I have to justify? What do I have to put my name to a decision and take the risk of that decision? And at the moment, that decision is, do I want to share data in this situation? And they face career risks. You, in fact, face 2 years in prison, potentially, if you do this wrong. And yet there's no cost to the fact that you might, entirely stuff up, diabetes care in London or vaccinations across the country or what have you by withholding the data. And what we want to do is say, actually, withholding the data is the thing that you need to justify. If you go and you think about it and go, yeah, the risks in this situation are great enough that we believe that they outweigh the benefits, that should be stopped. But that is the decision within these clusters that should be justified. And someone needs to put their name to owning that decision.
So this is actually quite a radical proposal, I guess, because, we've spent the last however many years as digital tools have become part of everyday life, we've established this entire infrastructure from like the ICO, the Information Commissioner downwards, of being completely paranoid about what data is being shared. Nobody wants to be the USB stick with the database on it left on a train or something like that. And now you're saying, no, we shouldn't be ultra protective. We shouldn't have everything locked as tightly as possible. We should be more willing to share things, and we should shift things more in that direction.
And it's a really good segue to sort of the third principle, which is lower compliance costs safely. Embedded in your question is this presumption that if we make sharing safely easier, it is less safe. And actually, I think, what we've learned through time is if you make the right thing to do hard, people find workarounds. I mean, what happens is you get situations like Afghanistan where, there was no good way for that person to share the information. So they are emailing Excels with hidden tabs that contain information you did not want out there. And that's what happens if you make the right thing difficult to do. So my contention would be, if you go back to the roads through the forest analogy, it is far more dangerous to drive down a country road than it is to drive down a highway. And why is that? It's because the highway is built to a high specification. There are the crash barriers either side. There are police that are patrolling that area, and it's well marked and well lit and well signposted. It's like that for data sharing. We create this profusion of ornate and bespoke data shares, which are an absolute maintenance nightmare for people to understand, catalog, and control, instead of having some shared data infrastructures with known secure implementation and protocols that are robustly tested and well maintained. And so that is a world we want. As a group of people, we've come from, working in areas with classified information. We come from working with healthcare data. We are absolutely not advocating for a wild west of data sharing, but we are saying, A, it is safer to do this stuff through shared infrastructure properly. And then B, yes, there is an element of saying, I had a conversation with someone, and they were going, if you share this data, we talk about, I think, data for free school meals. Someone might get doxxed. You might get a breach and they might get doxxed. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but we've got 200,000 children going to school hungry every day, not getting the full benefits of education, harming their life chances. That is an active harm that is happening now. And we've balanced that against this theoretical risk that someone might get doxxed if it's not as secure as it needs to be. And that for me isn't talking about going let's go to Wild West. It's just saying, let us make sure that we have understood the benefits and weighed them against the harms instead of looking only at the risks and sort of ignoring the benefit.
I'm going to ask you a Jeremy Paxman question here now, because I buy that as an argument. I find that very persuasive. But I guess in a sense, you are still, if you look at the sort of the trade-offs involved in a lot of data stuff, I imagine it a bit like a slider in that on the one hand, you've got ultra secure and lockdown. And on the other side, you've got, capability or what the government can do. And what you are essentially advocating is we move the slider a few more notches towards letting more stuff happen. And there is an inherent trade-off there, though we can try and make it safe. I guess we can't get past do you reject this trade-off completely, or do you think there is a trade-off there and you're just saying we should take the other side of it?
James, you promised me you weren't going to ask the tough questions, and now you've sprung this on me. It's a really good challenge, and one that I would make in your place too. And I think there's sort of two parts to that answer. The first is there is an awful lot we could do that increases risk negligibly. And the second is there is probably going to be a little bit of extra risk that you do want to take because the benefits far outweigh it. If we take, housing, or if we take roads, or if we take wind turbines and go, well, we want to have more of these, are we never going to make a wrong decision? Okay, at some point we might, have a harm. We might have lost a landscape or harmed a landscape that we might have ideally have liked to protect. But what's the alternative? It's not, again, we come back to the whole issue with the green lobby and environmentalism, which is we've stopped electrification and moving to renewable energy, which will solve a much bigger problem than, we were trying to protect with the data protection. I think, if I sort of extend your argument one step further, a lot of people get really quite concerned about authoritarian governments coming in and going, what do they do if they have this data? And I sort of say two things to that. Firstly, do you think that's going to stop them? I mean, we're not talking about the data the security services have. I don't know what that is, but I guess it's, a lot more than DFE talking to DWP about your kids' send requirements. And the second is, the reason why people are sort of asking, why looking for change, is that they're going, well, the current system isn't giving us public services that we're proud of and that we can rely on. And that's what we're trying to build. And actually, I think it's a classic case of penny wise, pound foolish. You're trying to guard against very small risks. Well, there's quite a significant concern that we lose trust and faith in public services and democracy. And so I think for me, that is the greater benefit that we need to keep our eye on here.
I knew you were going to outfox me with the planning metaphor there to try and win me over. That absolutely works. So you're now coming out with this. You published your recommendations and your research on your website, which we'll put a link to on abundancepod.com. But I want to ask you very finally, so this is coming at a time when we know that behind the scenes, the government, particularly DSITs, the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, they've got two sort of major programs going on, which is in this sort of area. There's the digital ID system, which has been very controversial so far. And that's essentially a move to sort of do this sort of joining up behind the scenes and help facilitate that sort of joining up. And then also there's the very mysterious National Data Library, which we actually talked about on the show a few months ago with Tom Forth a little bit. This is a thing I've written about because I'm sort of curious. It's this catchphrase that the government have used a lot, even though nobody seems to know quite what it is. So are you hoping that your ideas will influence whatever the National Data Library and the digital ID system turn out to be?
I would love it if that was the case. You're absolutely right. It's catchphrase. My favorite phrase is a floating signifier, something that we can read into it what we want. And I think the government is going through a process and hopefully will come through a process where they clearly define what they're trying to achieve with the National Data Library. And I would absolutely advocate for this to be a core part of it. We don't need data discovery. There's a solved problem 15 years ago, a company called Google, don't know if you heard about it. We know how to find resources if they're online. What we don't have is the processes and a single body in government that's really running with the question of how do we get this stuff used in anger properly, safely, securely, and for citizens' benefits. And so absolutely, it would be a fantastic thing for the NDL to do. It is also, going to be a big question for the Brit card, for the digital ID. One of the reasons why I think they've had trouble landing it is people always ask, so what? When you talk about data sharing, we talk about a lot of things. How you ask the question matters. And if you ask people like, hey, would it be really handy if you didn't have to carry around a paper or a plastic driver's license? People go, yeah, I'm really up for that. It's like, would it be really great if you could show your ID at Tesco and not have to wait, when you're buying wine and not have to wait for the guy to come over and look you up and down? And, if there's a safe and secure way to do that, people will be like, yeah, I'm up for that. And I think people are going to be asking for these more and more use cases of BritCard. Okay, we're raising the expectation of how joined up government's going to work. And what they're going to find if they don't really grapple with this question is that they can't build those use cases fast enough. They're going to spend years trying to get all the necessary approvals through. I was talking to a Labour staffer and his comment was one of the biggest challenges that the centre faces is the speed of getting anything done. And it's not very sexy working on the gubbins of data sharing, no more than it is planning or procurement or any of the fun stuff that you talk about on this podcast.
But it's a very exciting show.
I love it. Long time listener, first time on it. I think it's great. But it's not the most sexy stuff, but it needs to be done. Otherwise, the government's going to find that it wants to announce great things. Technically, they could do the work, but they won't be able to get it done because of problems with data sharing and with the other things we've mentioned.
Cool. And very finally, so the Data Alliance is, you've now published this research. You're out there talking about it. What's next? How can anyone listening who feels fired up and wants to sort of help bang the drum, what can they do to help your cause?
What can they do to help? A few things would be really brilliant. The first is case studies. If you can email us in with examples that you're experiencing of this going wrong, that I can talk policy and procedures all day long. Without those real human examples, this thing, won't get the traction it needs. The second thing is we need allies. So if you are in a position of influence, if you are in government and want to have conversations, we want to have those conversations too. If you can sponsor us in, if you work anywhere that you can, lend your name or your company's or organization's name to what we're doing, the more voices calling for this, the more seriously it's going to be taken. And the third is engage with us. Read our stuff, tell us why it will work, tell us why it won't work. We're not perfect and not everything's going to go forward. But it's only if we have these conversations, these real conversations about, if we want to move the dial, this is what we've got to change, that we're going to see any change at all.
Fantastic. We'll put links on abundancepod.com. But for now, Fabian Chessell, thank you very much. And Martin, that's just about it for this week's show. How do you think it's gone? It's been a big one.
It has. It's been, I mean, welcome back, James. It's good to have you back. It's good to be doing podcasts one at a time and not trying to cram 3 into a single weekend. No, it's good. I look forward to many more. We're nearly at the end of the year, James, which means we'll nearly have been doing this for an entire year at some point, which is quite thought-provoking. Going to have to think about the Christmas specials.
Well, yeah, if anyone's got a good idea for what we can do for a Christmas special, I think we talked about doing a tube trivia special. I'm up for that. I don't that seems like the sort of thing our audience would like. But yeah, do let us know if you've got any better ideas.
And if you know someone who you think would be good to quiz about the tube, lobby to have them contact us to come onto the show. And I'm sure that would be lots of fun as well.
I'm sure there is definitely some tube nerds listening. So yeah, let's do something tube related at Christmas. But anyway, we'll leave that for now. For now, abundancepod.com. Go and listen to the archive. There's loads of good stuff there. We've also got links to our Substacks on there. But for now, thanks for listening.
See you next week.